The book shows us lots of variations on matters that really matter to us. For instance, when you look at the serious issue of death, she writes, when someone dies, you don't say they died like you do here. My grandmother told me. You say things like that so easily here. He's dead, she's dead, they die. We say they are passing through their bodies, or their bodies have passed through. The body doesn't matter. And Anbo had a beautiful soul, so clean, so bright. Now she was going to a place where there is no more darkness.
That's how we see death as Buddhists. We don't see it as a permanent state, because you have many lives to get things right. You know, if you do things wrong, obviously you try and live the best life as you can, but you know, we believe in karma, so don't get it right this life, you'll be reborn into a different life there. Nothing is as permanent as it seems.
The book has a lots of concentration on growing up. And one of the things that struck me was how important dolly romances were to this young girl, looking to begin to understand how life could play itself out. And she writes, to raise a young girl, I realised you'd need gallons of social conditioner with added spirit deflator. Rub onto every limb until limp, put the child into a chair and wait until she sets. When appendages harden, you know you have a perfect young woman, so still and silent and sedate that you could wrap your precious one up in cotton wool and put her in a cabinet. Ah, look at the darling geisha behind the glass.
Thank you for reading out that passage. I was just thinking about, you know, when I wrote about social conditioner, that is how a young Southeast Asian girl is brought up. And there's a line in my book. My book isn't called Unpolished Gem so that it sounds like Amy Tan and I sell lots of copies. There's a good reason why it's called Unpolished Gem that a lot of people don't pick up. It's because there's this Chinese Cambodian saying that goes something like this. A girl is like cotton wool. Once she's dirty, she can never be clean again. A boy, on the other hand, though, well, it's a different matter. You know, it doesn't matter how dirty you get a boy, because a boy is like a gem. The more you polish a gem, the brighter it shines. And that's a terrible double sexual standard. It's not some fundamentalist archaic relic of some, you know, Asiatic past. Because when I go to school groups and I say that, the girls in the audience understand. They've got Paris Hilton pretending to be a role model. The boys, you know, sometimes I go to boys' schools as well. When I say that, they'll hoot and they'll holler and clutch their belts and say, yeah, miss, we're legends. So it's not confined to one particular culture. It's a sad thing that happens.
She was listening to try and understand about love, and her grandmother told her many things about relationships. And she had this expression called diseased with love, your grandmother. What did she mean by that?
Oh, that's a very good question, because my grandmother, you know, always taught me to be a proper, you know, not to move around too much and just sitting there ossifying until someone came. But it was only much later that I realised she was diseased with love, because my grandfather had two wives. She was his second wife. She wasn't his first wife. And he had a first wife in Cambodia. He was a school teacher. My grandmother came from China, and she was kicked out of China. Now, I write articles. No one kicks me out of anything. People might complain. But she wrote articles because her family sent her to school to become a teacher. And they were a peasant family. They had very enlightened views. So instead of going off and becoming a teacher, she decided to write articles in her early 20s about the landlords abusing the rights of the peasants. And so China said, you're in big trouble, we'll get you. And so she hopped on a boat and went to Cambodia. A lot of people think Asia is exactly, you know, if you're all Asian, you're all similar culture. A Chinese person going to Cambodia is like an Australian going to Eastern Europe or going to Norway. Completely different culture, language, climate, everything. So she went to China, and that's where she met my grandfather. And he already had a wife. And his first wife, this isn't in the book, but his first wife said to my grandfather, she was very unhappy, and she said, fine, if you want to marry this wife, you have to make her carry tea to me. there's a tradition. If you carry tea to someone, you supplicate yourself before them. You kneel down before them and you carry tea and you serve them. And that's symbolic, that the first wife has the prominent position. So my grandmother did that. And then she had 10 kids with my grandfather. 2 of them died and 1 of them she gave away. The reason she gave this child away was because my grandfather's first wife, she only had girls. She had 2 girls. She couldn't have any boys. And so my grandfather said, oh, you've got enough kids, just give one to the other side. So my father grew up next, very close, across the street from his brother, without ever knowing that was his real brother. And I just imagine the pain that my grandmother must have gone through to relinquish this child.
Talk about success and loneliness. After it was about 15 years or so, there was more money and your mother didn't have to go to work, or didn't have to work. And you wrote, they were living their dream lives of the rich and idle in Phnom Penh, and yet their imposed idleness made them inarticulate and loud. They didn't know how to live this life of luxury and loneliness. Used to working for others all their lives. They did not know how to be idle without guilt, and they could not stop working.
That was very true for my mother. Now, this is one thing that is quite important, and that sometimes I talk about quite a bit because it's important to me. My mother doesn't speak English, and when I go, sometimes people ask me at writers' festivals or at library talks, Alice, you work as a writer, you work as a lawyer. Your mother's been here 28 years. She can't even speak English. They ask with the best of intentions. They don't understand that. But if you can understand that my mother only got up to grade 2 in Chinese school in Cambodia, as part of ethnic cleansing, the very first step was they closed down all the Chinese school. So she's illiterate, almost illiterate. So when she was 13, she started working in a plastic bag factory owned by this grandmother who had 8 kids and had to give one away, and who was a single mother. She started this plastic bag factory and hired very young employees because they were the most nimble. My mother was one of them. And since then, my mother has not stopped working since she was 13. And when she came to Australia, she built up this ideal of the great Australian dream. We'll work so hard, we'll get this big house in Avondale Heights. Our kids will go off to good universities, they'll become successful. And, once all the work is done, I'll sit back and relax and live a life of luxury. The big house was built when I was 17, going through my, high schooling certificate. And my mother would sit down. We were all at school at that time. She'd turn on the TV and she couldn't understand anything. She couldn't understand a word they were saying. She'd worked for about so many years in the garage. Nothing talks to you in the garage. The machines don't speak English to you. So when I tell that story, I can say, if you imagine that you're an illiterate Australian, you can't read and write, and they send you off to Japan to learn Japanese, it's very difficult for you to pick up Japanese. If you couple that with having 4 kids and trying to bring them out of poverty, because, we weren't that well off in Braybrook, we made the best of what we had, then it's almost an impossibility. And when my sister was 5 years old, my mother was 40, and I was 17. So I used to teach my sister's readers from school. Pat is a cat, and she would read the book. She would read it once. She read that book 3 times. And I thought, this is awesome. My mother is really, really learning English now. And then she threw the book away and she started to cry. And I said, Mum, you never taught us, you taught us never to give up, and you've chucked away the book and you've read it 3 times without making a single mistake. And so my mum picked the book back up again. She turned to the middle page. She pointed to a word and she said, I don't understand what this says. I don't even know I can't read it. I've just memorised it from when you first read it to me. That's how, because she doesn't understand letters. But there are other things she can do. She can't read street signs, but she can drive long distances much better than I could. And that's an incredible thing.
Do you want to read either of those 2 paragraphs there about
Which one?
There's when she was...
Oh, yeah, sure. So there is a generation of Southeast Asian women, or even even Greek, Italian women who have come to me in their 60s and said, oh, you know, when you wrote those chapters, no one has ever written about that experience before of us being alone at home for decades of our lives. You've brought it to the forefront. People can see now. And so depression, the doctor called it, but my mother did not know what that meant. Scattered thoughts, she told Dr. Cheng. That's all they are, these crazy scattered thoughts. I think about all our money disappearing at the shop. I think of losing everything and my heart thumps like crazy and it's unbearable. Sickness in the heart, she said, a sickness in the heart she needed to get checked out. It was physical, she reckoned, and once the doctors could give her some medication for her heart thumping much harder than it should, then she would be closer to recovery. So the doctor gave her little white pills in a cardboard box with bold red writing. Zoloft. Take these twice a day, he told her, and wait, be patient and wait. They will not work straight away. But my mother couldn't stand to be still in the house. In the house she could not stand still. It was so hollow, so many hours to fill. How could she fill them up? By wiping down the fridge or washing the sheets. She would drive to the supermarket and do what she'd always done. Buy food on sale, look for the green fluorescent stickers, and at the register count out the exact amount in notes and coins. It's a very migrant thing to do, because if you give the wrong change, or people give you the wrong change back, you don't know how to tell them that's the wrong change, so you count out the exact number of coins. But after a while, she didn't even know what she was buying. She walked into the supermarket stunned, not because there was so much to be had, but because none of it made any sense now or brought any happiness. And this is a very, very different passage to the very start when she goes into a supermarket for the first time in her life, and I almost pop out there on the spot because she's bewildered. There's so much food. She operated like an automaton. First she would go to the trolley filled with broken clearance items, then she would find the sale bread or the discount day-old bread, and then any miscellaneous things on special. Once she brought home 20 250-gram blocks of Nestle chocolate in different flavours. $1.50 a block, she said. Never seen such a price before. Without the energy or thought to hide them around the house, she left them in the cupboard above the oven range hood. My siblings and I went through 1.5 blocks a day each, and she didn't even notice. It's funny now, it wasn't funny at that time.
One of the things I enjoyed was descriptions of Chinese beliefs. And there's one here on the gods.
Oh yes, this passage I'm about to read is, I went to a grammar school in my last year of high schooling, and we're in a literature class, studying paganism, and the teacher said, what other cultures believe in many gods? And then she turned to me and she said, for example, the Chinese, they believe in worship many gods, don't you, Alice? And I did not think of my grandmother and her many gods, the chants, the plastic blue meditation mat, the swirls and whirls of the pattern on it, 10,000 shades of blue like a frenzied ocean, the smell of incense in my pores. We lit a lot of incense when I was growing up. We grew up in Braybrook. The incense was religious, but a lot of the time it was to hide the smell of pee on the carpets and the Invicta Carpet Factory chemicals around the house. Those red-faced, sword-wielding God whom we kept outside, the good-for-business God whom we called grandfather, the goddess of mercy with her china-white face, her royal porcelain contentedness, sitting serenely on a lotus, surrounded by bold little babies pouring water out of a vase, and the dust falling on them in the new house, because we no longer had Granny to maintain the shrine, and we no longer needed to light incense to hide the smell of baby pee rising from the carpets. By that time my grandmother had had a stroke, so I turned back and read about King Lear going mad. Mad, mad, poor mad and cold old man, growing old and senile with his grotty ally Gloucester. I did not think about my grandmother diarrheaing all over the floor, the mess to be cleaned up by the latest Shanghai carer, who we declared as our cousin to health authorities because secrets should never be told. She was an illegal worker. Oh, the madness, the passion, the pain and the poignancy of King Lear. This is life, this is distilled emotion, cried my literature teacher. Oh, the beauty and the horror. So in my essays I wrote about the beauty and the horror and the madness and the glory. I didn't think about the madness of my grandmother, whose mind was still so sharp but who could only stare at the ceiling and wait for my auntie to arrive home from work. None of that seemed real at school. The only sort of real that had any meaning and depth was depicted in the white and black pages of Shakespeare, where the University of Human Experience was accessible only to erudite people who could read it. We were living a new life now. There was no room in my head for death and disease and illness.
On page 177, something that did surprise me happens.
Oh, what was that? You'll be a surprise to me too. Yes. Okay. I was 17 and all the right things seemed to happen to me at the right time. You know, I'd got into a good school, I got the usual Asian high achiever marks, I'd even been asked out by a boy. But the right things, like everything else in my life, had their false, unsettling undertones. In the good school, I existed slumped against walls and slinking through corridors. And the sunshine boy who asked me out told me that he had put a gun to someone's head at 15 because he was so angry that his mate was chasing. And chasing means, you probably know it means procuring for drugs. I would go to the grammar school and watch the clean bad boys downloading angry rap lyrics about the same issues over the internet, because life here was not a life, man. This is the life. This is the life. That was a life, and they were lucky they only had to live it vicariously.
So this is when you started to become depressed, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, I did.
Yes.
I had a tough year that year because my mother was going through her midlife crisis. She couldn't learn English. She was on Zoloft. My grandmother was quite ill, and my little sisters were, I looked after them a lot more because my mother was ill. And there's this teachers and very kind-hearted people, my family, people who love you, tell you that you have to grow up and be successful. What I think is most important for young people these days is they're always being told that they have to be successful. No one has ever told them, no one ever told me, or sat me down and said, Alice, you are going to fail in life. You're going to fail so abysmally at one point in your life that, you'll never know what hit you, but you're going to be able to get back up again. You're going to be dignified about it, you're going to be stoic, and life will go on. And if someone had told me that, it would have been much easier for me. But we're so focused on a narrative of success, not just migrants, but Australian Idol, Anthony Robbins, everyone, that it's very difficult for young people to realise that sometimes crap happens. So I get asked to speak to schools a lot. I get given topics a lot. And the topics are secret of success and how to achieve your best. And so I'll go up there and I'll say, today I'm going to talk about failure because that's more important than talking to you about, success. My whole book is a book of failures.
Alice doesn't spend a lot of time in the book, but I know she does admire teachers and the value they were in her life. There's a little passage here when she goes to a school dance, and she says, with my camera I migrated to my older teachers, the sanest people in the whole royal red and gold room, full of colour like a watermelon turned inside out, soft and pastel and pink in some places and yet sharp and blood red in others. The future people would get their photographs developed from this evening and see the yesterday girl, the small one standing next to them, the one wearing a funny 12-year-old bridesmaid's dress, and 5 years down the track they would not remember her name. I had nothing to lose, so I walked up to Edmund Chan Johnson, tall, awkward Edmund with the serious brown eyes who had no idea that he had been loved all year by the silent girl sitting 2 seats behind him in literature class.
Oh, that's embarrassing. But I was just telling Kerry, and this is entirely everything that I am today, my language, everything I have inside my head in English has been given to me by my teachers. If you can imagine, my parents came here. We don't have cultural capital. We don't have books in the house when I was growing up. Everything that I've been taught was taught by teachers. I would not be a writer or a lawyer or a teacher today if it were not for the many teachers that contributed. We came as blank slates. We have a Cambodian history that had been wiped out by Pol Pot. We didn't grow up knowing about Shakespeare or even about anything until it was put in our heads. And so that's why it's so important that you get good teachers for migrant children, because everything you put in that head stays there in some form or another.
She braves the world and goes out with a boy who she calls Michael, and then he's able to come to dinner. And her father says, "Michael, I'm very impressed by the way you handle chopsticks." So you can imagine the tension at the meal. And there was, of course, no, "Oh, just call me Bob, Joe, Jack, mate," from my father. My father's idea of getting familiar with someone was to tell them war stories. He didn't do it to sober them up or to edify them. He did it to crack them up. He says, "This dish reminds me of the Pol Pot years when the starved dead bodies floated up the river during the flood. I got the job of dragging them to higher, dry land. We wrapped them up in a dry blanket and me and my mate grabbed onto each end. Each time we stripped the blanket we would get water-soaked and even heavier. Ha ha, so funny. There we were, both probably only weighing 70 kilos between us, trying to drag this dead body 3 times our weight. And listen to this, my mate turns to me and says, 'Hope you're not going to be this heavy when it's time for me to drag you.' And I say to him, 'What do you mean, you drag me? I'm going to be the poor soul who will be dragging you.'" She persists with this boyfriend, and you should say a few things about Michael, because it was a terrific relationship. It was a very important one for you growing up, wasn't it?
Oh, it was my first relationship. This boy named Michael, whose real name is Damien, and he doesn't mind me saying this. I called him Michael because I'd written the book and I hadn't shown it to him, and there are 5 chapters in it about him, so I had to change his name. And he came from Clunes, not Western Australia, Clunes, where Ned Kelly was filmed, very rural Australia. And so when my book came out, I sat Michael across the table. We hadn't seen in a number of years, and he was moving to America forever to do a PhD and to live there. And I said, "Michael, you know, I've got a book for you." And he said, "Oh, you've written a book? That's wonderful, Alice." And I said, "Oh yeah," and there's about 4 or 5 chapters of you in it. And I watched to see his face fall, and it didn't. He said, "That's fantastic." He had not read a single word I'd written, but that was how much faith he had in me, that, you know, I wrote it with the best of intentions. And after he read it, he said, "Alice, this book is a love letter to your community." And that was the best way of putting it. And now he took my book to America because he said, "Oh, you know, this book is the best CV I'll ever get if I get a new girlfriend." Look at this.
Her mother was concerned about her having boyfriends and, of course, tried to give her some advice. She says, "I was well aware of my mother's list of objections to potential husbands. Don't marry an Aussie, they sleep around and have no morals. Don't marry a Cantonese, they will gamble away the family fortune. Don't marry a Vietnamese because they are charmers and spend too much. Don't marry a Chow, is it Chow? Chow?
Yeah.
Because they are stingy and spend too little."
That's us. We are. No, I mean, that's our ethnicity. That's what she thinks of us.
"But whatever you do, you must not remain unmarried." There's also an issue, a moment when Alice and Michael were caught vacuuming in the bedroom.
Yes, many cultural differences. Australian kids would be able to take their boyfriends and give them a peck on the cheek or even kiss them at the age of 16, or maybe some families 18. That would be considered normal. We are not even meant to hold hands until we're engaged, you know. So my parents built this massive house in Avondale Heights. It had 2 stories, and my mother was going to go out one day. They always supervised us when Michael was in the house. I was not 18 then, I was 20. I had to condense my age so that the book fitted. All the stories are true, but I was 20, you know. And my mum said, "Oh, I've got to go out now, you know. Make sure he doesn't go upstairs, because you know what could happen if he goes upstairs." And I said, "Nothing will happen." She goes, "You better watch it." So anyhow, my mother went out with my sisters, drove them to their classes or something. And I said, "Hey, Michael, let's go upstairs. I wasn't planning to do anything untoward. I said, let's just go upstairs, because I wanted to defy my mother. And he was scared. He said, oh no, your mother will come back and that'll be the end of us. They'll put you under house arrest, which they did tend to do in my adolescence. If they were unhappy with me, I'd be under house arrest, like Aung San Suu Kyi. So anyhow, I was with Michael. I took him upstairs and I kissed him. And it wasn't the first time I did it, and it probably wasn't the last time. And then my mother came home, like we were just sitting there by us, we weren't doing anything untoward. And I saw her downstairs, I saw the car pull in, and then I walked downstairs and I said, just follow me, just take my, and so Michael was scared as well. And my mum said, what were you doing with him upstairs? And I said, oh, we were vacuuming. And she said, and then that night she told my dad, and my dad was too embarrassed to ask me to make me validate this story in case, I popped out with some very unexpected things, like we weren't really vacuuming, no. So he was very embarrassed about that.
Would you put your hands together and thank Alice?